All right, everybody, welcome back. I hope you were able to stretch your legs and refresh your coffee. I have the honor of introducing our next speaker. Melissa Nantes is the Advanced Tiers Coordinator at Michigan's MTSS Technical Assistance Center. In this role, she focuses on integrating academic, social, emotional, and behavioral supports at the advanced tiers, working to intensify student instruction and intervention. Before joining the TA Center, Melissa gained diverse experience as a school psychologist, educational consultant, and university professor. She holds a master's and doctorate in school psychology from the University of Cincinnati and is a board-certified behavior analyst. It is my pleasure to introduce Melissa Nantes.
Thanks, Lisa. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to be here today. If you could do me a favor and navigate to menti.com or scan the QR code on the screen, there are a few questions that'll give us a little bit of information about who's joining us. So you can scan the QR code or go to menti.com and enter the code on your screen. I'll give folks a moment or two to get there. Once you're in there, there's going to be a space for you to answer all the questions you see on the screen. And I'm going to ask Lisa or Kate to put that Menti code into the chat in your space so that you can get to it. And then I'm going to move us on. All right, here we go. So here is our opening code for today's session. If you're applying for sketches, you're going to need the opening code of 5489. 5489. And at the end, I'll provide the closing code. So our session today is about addressing the chicken and the egg, the integrating supports for students. And we're going to be very intentional about talking about that integration. But before we get into the content, I just want to take a minute to tell you a little bit about myself. Lisa did an awesome job talking about giving you some background information about who I am. But I wanted to just give a little bit more. So as Lisa mentioned, I'm the Advanced Tiers Coordinator for Michigan's MTSS Technical Assistance Center. I actually started my educational career at Grand Valley State University as an art education major. And through a series of twists and turns that are fairly typical during that first year of college, I ended up leaving Grand Valley and landed at the University of Detroit Mercy with no clue what I wanted to do. But at that time, I was really enjoying psychology classes, so I made that my major. I had tried to figure out a way to be a professional student as a career, but that was not an available path. So psychology is what it was, and I continued. I finished up at University of Detroit Mercy, and then went on to the University of Cincinnati. And as Lisa mentioned, got both my master's and doctorate in school psychology there, and had the great pleasure of working as a school psychologist for a number of years in the greater Cincinnati area. And then when I came back to Michigan, working in the Kalamazoo Public Schools, I bopped around a little bit over to back to the University of Detroit Mercy. I'm faculty there in their school psychology program before I landed here at the MiMTSS TA Center. And because I still have that desire to be a professional student, I did go back and complete some coursework to become a board-certified behavior analyst. Just had that for about a year now. And, it just allowed me to add a few more letters after my name, but also helped me further deepen my understanding of this integration of academics and behavior. And this good-looking crew of folks on the screen right now, these are my nieces and nephews. They are a big part of my life, and I adore all of them. And they have been on the receiving end of the application of my learning as a school psychologist and a board-certified behavior analyst for most of their life. Just don't tell them that I've done this. And I'm just really excited to be here as a part of today's symposium. So what I want to do to kick us off is acknowledge the hard work that we are all engaged in right now in this continued professional learning. We're here, we're committed for the day to this professional learning. And there may be times when we get stuck along the way in our learning. So you'll see here on the slide some common strategies that we as adults can use when we get stuck. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment to read the commitment at the top of the slide, Review these possible solutions. And then when you're ready to be committed to the learning, that engagement, go ahead and type the word ready in the chat. Or if you're at a viewing party with others, just turn to an elbow partner and let them know you're ready. Okay, I can envision lots of readies being said at those viewing parties and lots of folks putting the word ready in the chat. So as our director of the TA Center, Dr. St. Martin likes to talk about the mantra of clear is kind. And so in that spirit, here are our outcomes for our time together today. The title of the session kind of hints at that. We're really going to hone in on this integration of academic support and social emotional behavioral health within our MTSS framework, and talk about that in relation to students with the characteristics of dyslexia. My intent is that everyone's going to be able to walk away with the ability to describe that integration and recognizing really concrete strategies that can help support creating a safe, predictable, and engaging learning environment. For some, these strategies may be new. For others, you're going to say, oh, I know, I'm familiar with these strategies, or I use these. And so it's going to confirm and reinforce the things that you are doing and maybe help you further refine that. And finally, I want to make sure that all of us have an opportunity to walk away with a mini action plan to support translating the learning into practice. If you saw the message or downloaded materials, you would have seen this note catcher. It's just a place for you to capture some ideas as we go throughout our time today. But if you don't have it, it's okay. A blank piece of paper works just as well. But wanted to make sure you had a chance to capture things, ideas as we go through our time together. So here we are at a dyslexia summit, and you might be asking yourself, well, what does social emotional behavioral health have to do with the characteristics of dyslexia? And if you've thought about that, it's a great question. If you haven't, that's okay. We're going to spend some time talking about it. So this morning, Dr. St. Martin shared with us the definition of dyslexia that had been adopted and is in PA 146. It's also listed in our dyslexia handbook. And I just want to bring our attention to that last phrase in the second section. This idea that the specific learning disorder may include secondary consequences, such as problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary, and then that last part, and lead to social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties. I've had the opportunity to hear Dr. St. Martin present on PA 146 and dyslexia a few times now. And one of the things she often highlights is that specific portion of the definition. And she will often say, as far as she knew, Michigan was the only state that had included that potential secondary consequence of social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties right within our definition. Well, as I mentioned before, I tried to figure out how to be a professional student. I also really love data. And so I heard Kim say this a few times, and I thought, well, gosh, what is the accuracy of that statement? Like, I don't believe she'd make that up, but let me know. Let me figure out how to find out. So is it a big deal that we have specifically in our definition that social, emotional, behavioral difficulties may be a secondary consequence of students with dyslexia? And the answer is, yeah, it is a big deal. The International Dyslexia Association, they talk about how dyslexia can have significant effects on our emotional well-being. And over the winter break, I found myself getting an oil change. And during that time, the oil change, I had my computer and I went to all 50 states Department of Education websites just to see what's what. And I looked at all those definitions, and it does turn out that, in fact, as of December 23rd of last year, Michigan is the only state whose definition of dyslexia specifically includes social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties as possible secondary consequences. Now, the majority of the states seem to have adopted the definition of dyslexia from the International Dyslexia Association. This does not imply at all that IDA does not see this connection. In fact, the International Dyslexia Association, they actually have a document titled Social and Emotional Difficulties Related to Dyslexia, where this quote at the top of the slide came from. This connection has been long recognized between students who are struggling to learn to read, students with dyslexia, and the connection to the impact on our social, emotional, behavioral health. But what Michigan has done is they've made that connection explicit right in the definition, which is going to have implications for how we support students with characteristics of dyslexia, as well as the professional learning provided to our hardworking Michigan educators. And we're going to dig deeper into this connection a little bit and why it's important for us to be thinking about this integration of academic and social emotional behavioral health. So as I mentioned, I am a board certified behavior analyst. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about behavior science basics, because I think these some of these basics will help us put into more perspective why this is so important. So the first concept I want us to hold on to and learn about when it comes to behavior science is that behavior always occurs within a context. It does not happen in a vacuum. There's always some kind of context. We may not always immediately see or recognize the full components of that context, but it's there. The context is best captured in what we refer to as an ABC paradigm. Hang with me here. For any behavior, there's always going to be this antecedent that occurs before the behavior. It helps to set the stage for the behavior to happen. The behavior itself, which is the actual action or response, and the consequence, which is what happens after the behavior. In behavior science, the term consequence doesn't mean the same thing as it does in everyday use. It purely means what happens right after the behavior. If the consequence reinforces that behavior, it's going to increase the likelihood that the behavior will happen again in the future. There's a lot more to this in behavior science, but this is the basic concept of the ABC paradigm. And it's going to help us set the stage for what's coming next in our time together this morning. So let me give you just a couple examples. So here is Val. Val makes a funny comment about her teacher, but since we know behavior doesn't occur in a vacuum, there's some kind of context, we can look for those antecedents and consequences. So in this case, the antecedent is that Val's working in a group and her group mates are kind of ignoring her and her ideas until she makes a funny comment about the teacher. The funny comment has her classmates laughing and telling her how funny she is. And suppose this peer attention is reinforcing to her. Then the next time Val finds herself in a similar situation, she's more likely to engage in that same behavior to get access to that peer attention and interaction. This is the behavior science at work. It's lawful like this. So here's another example. This time we're going to start with the antecedent. So in this example, we've got a young child, John, who is in the pediatrician's office, at the waiting room of the pediatrician's office. And he begins to pace around and talking to his mom about being scared because he remembers getting that shot during his last visit. His mom is going to hug him and comfort him, reassure him that's going to be okay. And that's comforting to him. So next time he's at the pediatrician, the next time he's feeling, remembering that experience that was unpleasant, and he's talking about that and he's pacing, he knows that when he's pacing and talking about that, his mom is going to be there to reassure him. Our third and final example, we're going to bring it into the classroom. So in this case, the class is taking turns reading aloud from a text led by the teacher. The student puts his head down, pulls his hoodie up, whatever it is, and goes to sleep. When the teacher gets there, the student to that student, the teacher decides to skip over that student and calls on the next student to read. If this student is reinforced by not having to read out loud, it increases the likelihood that the behavior, we'll see that behavior again in the future when it comes to being asked to read out loud. Right? So it's that behavior science in action. So the second behavior science concept that I want to talk a little bit about, so the first one being that behavior always has a context. The second is behavior is learned. So that ABC paradigm demonstrates the connections being made, right? We make that connection from the antecedent to the behavior to the consequence. And then we're likely, as we learn that, we're likely to repeat that pattern. We know that behaviors are learned because if the behavior serves a reason, a function, it's going to continue for that student. So we know behaviors that are learned continue. It's because they serve a function for that individual. When you hear that term function, I want you to think of three different words that mean the same thing. It's the reason, the purpose, or the why. So when you hear function, think reason, purpose, or why. If you're viewing this in a group, turn to your elbow partner right now and say function means reason, purpose, or why. If you're viewing it alone, go ahead and say it out loud. No one's going to laugh. But that rehearsal is going to help you move it into your longer term memory. So when I say function, you're going to be saying and thinking reason, purpose, and why. Function helps us to identify what's happening. So when we engage in behavior, because we have learned it is associated with the likelihood of a more desirable outcome for us. So our mantra for this idea is behavior continues because the behavior works. It works in some way. It serves a function, a reason, or a purpose or why for us. It's not necessarily at a conscious level, but we've made that association. So functions of behavior. This is our third behavior science concept that we're going to talk about this morning. Function, remember reason, purpose, or why, can be one of two categories: to access, obtain, or get something, or to avoid or escape from something. So the things that we might access are listed on the left hand of the slide. Some examples of what we might avoid or escape are listed on the right hand of the slide. These are possibilities, but the idea is when we think about function, the reason, the purpose, or why for behavior, it's going to fall into one of two categories: to get access to or obtain something, or to avoid or escape from something. So we're going to listen to a couple of video clips that take this behavior science in closer to students in the classroom, in particular students in reading. So the following two clips are from Children of the Code Project. They're brief clips. We're going to hear a combination of information from students as well as some researchers and other prominent folks in the field of reading.
I'd make a scene not to do it. They would. I'd just act out, sleep, just wouldn't get up, just wouldn't ignore the teachers, just wouldn't talk, just rebel. It's the only thing I could do. I was just embarrassed. And wouldn't get up there and try and fail at a word and hear everybody laugh.
When children are not able to meet the challenges of the complex processes of reading or of early math, not only do they begin to say things to themselves like I'm no good or I can't do this, which inhibits their ability to maintain attention and actually recruit their cognitive processes. But over time, they begin to develop an aversion to certain contexts and to sitting down and actually looking at books. Even before they sit down, they're already feeling upset, a sense of failure, maybe confusion, low frustration tolerance. And therefore, we get them to the point where they don't actually even enjoy engaging in the process. It's not just that they're maybe feeling confused when they actually don't know the difference between an F and an R, but they're actually feeling it even before they enter the process of even trying to process the information. And so for many children, we see another level over time developing, not that they just show anxiety or confusion or frustration in the task itself, but now they show it in approaching the task.
If not every time a child reads, but reliably every once in a while when a child reads, that child experiences shame. And that feels awful. And that codes reading as a powerful source of shame. Wouldn't a child be stupid to voluntarily do something that's going to humiliate him?
And why go out there, put yourself on the line if you know that it's going to be another failure and that you're going to be called on it, either by your teacher or by your classmates, and you're open to shame, you're open to disapproval. I mean, kids aren't dumb. They know when something isn't working and they know what's going to hurt. So they pull back.
They will escape from the situation one way or another.
I'd just make up an excuse. Say I don't have glasses with me. That normally works. But I don't wear glasses. So it kind of busted me in the long run.
I always used to like slump down in my seat or something where they couldn't see me, or like if they wanted me to read, I'd pretend like I'm trying to figure out a question or something. That way they wouldn't pick me or anything. And yeah, it's pretty much what I've been doing for as long as I know.
Go to the bathroom, dug my head down, just make it look like I wasn't paying attention so they wouldn't call on me.
it was almost my turn to read, I would ask to use the restroom and wait until it was done and then come back in. And one time, I was about to get an award for helping out some kids, and then they wanted me to read off my kid's name and everything because I didn't remember what their name was. So I had left to go to the restroom and went till the whole thing was over.
And I'd act like I was asleep so they couldn't call on me. Or if they did call on me, I'd wake up and say I can't read and go back to sleep and refuse to.
So that was our first video. Oops. Go ahead and in the chat or turn to an elbow partner, the examples that we heard from students talking about what they did when it came to reading, time to read, would you categorize those more as accessing, getting, obtaining something, or escaping or avoiding? Just go ahead and tell your elbow partner or put it in the chat. So I'm hoping most of you are saying, right, like that was an escape or avoid, right? They're avoiding that difficult task. And Ms. Rowell-Smith this morning, when we were talking about PA 146, talked about how that comes into play, especially for older students, as that reading difficulty persists. So we're just going to watch one more clip, again, from the Children of the Code.
If something reliably triggers shame, it's going to prevent learning, and it's going to make someone shy away from what triggered shame.
None of us gravitate toward activities that leave us with a sense of inadequacy or frustration, and especially if we see no resolution to that feeling.
I could see even with the 9-year-olds that when they were unable to read, it seemed to me even if I had a magic bullet, they didn't want to deal with it. They had already started to avoid print. And a lot of these kids would become active and look, in a sense, attentionally different, and possibly would have been diagnosed as ADD, but their attentional difficulties were just simple avoidance. They would become distractible. They would become fidgety when they had to read. The reason is they want to get out of that.
And if we've had enough bad experience reading, even though we may be shown a new way to read by a new teacher in a new situation, and it was really worth our while to pay strict attention to this new way, we may be motivated to pay no attention to it because we're certain we're going to have a bad experience.
You can see it in their behavior. Like, here's this tough kid, he's reading and he's, sounding out, or he's identifying this word, the man went, that's was. And here's his body, like that. Like, what is he saying? He's saying, I knew it. I knew I couldn't do this. I knew it would be no better this time than it's been how many thousand of other times. How many people have, tried to do this with me? I mean, give me a break. I can't do it.
People who have a feeling of shame or confusion tend to shut down. They don't expand their knowledge. They don't really reach their potential because their whole behavior is geared toward protecting themselves against being exposed for their lack of literacy skills or that limited literacy skills.
Like when I'm taking a test and it takes me a minute to read it all, and I don't want to feel stupid because everybody else is already done with their test and I'm taking a minute for it. I'm like the last person. I don't want them to think that I'm stupid, and I'm taking too long on a test. And I know teachers think that you're taking your time and stuff, but sometimes we have to, hurry up before the class period's over. I need more time than that, so I just hurry up and do it, and then I get a bad grade on it.
So you end up having problems in other grades with your grades in other classes. It isn't about your understanding. It's about sometimes just how long it's taking you to do things because of the reading.
Mm-hmm.
And the teachers, you're saying, don't understand that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I never told them that just hurry up and do it because I don't want to take forever and then them get mad at me because I'm taking so long. So
have you not told them because you're embarrassed and you don't like talking about it?
Yeah.
we haven't recognized in modern pedagogy the experience of shame and how it prevents children from learning.
When they begin to feel disappointed, angry, bored, they lose that sense of curiosity and interest in the task. They begin to say things to themselves like, this is no fun, I'm no good at this, my mom thinks I can't do it. And then the cognitive attributions begin to come in. And when children start to feel, I'm no good at this, then their emotional interest in the task begins to decline rapidly. And then their attention wanders, and then you see another level of problem with the task. It's not just their emotional arousal, because we're all varying in emotional arousal all day, but now we have the cognitive attributions that this task is too hard, I'm never going to be good at it. And when those attributions kick in, now we have another level of emotion regulation difficulty. And the more that happens, especially in classroom contexts in which children of all levels of a processing are trying to manage the same tasks with one teacher, this is where children start to get turned off to reading and learning processes.
All right, so we've seen and heard from students and researchers alike about this connection between the difficulty with reading and escape avoidance kinds of behaviors or other behavioral concerns. And in my career as a school psychologist, I've seen lots of students who have struggled with reading and as a result started to engage in those escape avoidance behaviors that were problematic in a school setting. I've also seen lots of students who've had social emotional behavioral difficulties such that started to interfere with their ability to learn. And so back in my early days as a school psychologist, my intern supervisor would talk about this ultimate chicken or the egg scenario. Which came first? Was it the reading difficulties that led to social and behavioral needs, or was it the difficulties with social emotional behavioral skills that led to academic difficulties? In reality, it doesn't matter which came first if we're very intentionally approaching this in our plan of support in an integrated way, addressing both the academics and behavior support together. Even better, we could proactively and preventatively address both before the problems occur or get worse, right? If we think about that from an integrated perspective. And so there's some research out there on the integrated academic and SEBH support. So like when we do these two things together, what happens? And it's fascinating to me in this work of the multi-tiered system of support, this integrated nature of academics and behavior. We know that difficulties in one area, reading or behavior, can actually have the power enough to predict difficulties in other areas. So that first idea that connection between the two is so powerful. If we take it a little further, research has actually shown that poor academic skills in early elementary grades can actually be a predictor of behavioral difficulties in later grades. That second study by McIntosh et al. Back in 2006 started looking at that trajectory of students who were as early as kindergarten and first grade showing difficulties with their reading, early literacy, their foundational skills, and looked at those students later on and the ability to predict based on their literacy skills early on, how many office discipline referrals they might have. So that we definitely see that connection there. On the flip side, which is really good, we know that those behavioral difficulties are often tied to that function, the reason, purpose, why of escaping or avoiding something that's difficult for them. And in this case, we're talking about reading. And if you think about that for a minute, if on a daily basis you are asked to engage in an activity that's really, really difficult for you and your peers observed your struggle, would you want to do it? I know I wouldn't. I know I would try and find ways to get out of that, try and find ways to spend my time elsewhere. The other part that's really fascinating to me is not only do these two things, this academics and behavior kind of work together and we can use them to predict difficulties in one area and the other, is that when we truly have interventions that are integrated, that are addressing academics and behavior together, not parallel, not sequentially, but really integrated, we can see bigger and better positive results than if we just started working on academics or just started working on behavior alone. But if we truly do an integration, we can see that combined effect is going to have more positive improvements for students. So if we're thinking about this integrated approach, there was a study not too long ago, back in 2021, where they evaluated an intervention that was established specifically to combine the focus on improving reading and engagement. And this happened to be with second grade students. And when they looked at that, the outcomes showed significant improvements from baseline, from before the intervention began to after, in both behavior and reading. And they surveyed and looked at the acceptability of the intervention from the perspective of the teachers and the students, and found high levels of acceptability in an intervention that specifically addressed both reading and behavior together. And so the implications here on the slide, it's a matter of efficiency and effectiveness. We don't have time to waste. We have limited time, minutes in a day of school, time in school. And so we have to leverage and maximize what we do. So if we very intentionally work at an integrated approach to instruction, both preventative and an intervention, then we're going to get more, as they say, bang for our buck, more outcomes for students. And then if we come back to the implications for students with characteristics of dyslexia, we know that these students may encounter significant negative consequences, not only in academics, but in the areas of social, emotional, behavioral health. So why not approach our supports for students, all students, including students with characteristics of dyslexia, in a way that is an integrated model that is more efficient, effective, and equitable for all of our students. So to get us there, we look at a multi-tiered system of support. And so, as we mentioned, I work for Michigan's MTSS Technical Assistance Center, but we know that a multi-tiered system of support is a way to support all learners without delay. So Dr. Strom talked a little bit about the old model of wait to fail, right? And so this MTSS framework is designed to support all students in a multi-tiered system that provides us with a collection of evidence-based practices that are meant to support the whole child and support all learners. So the MDE MTSS practice profile actually has a definition of MTSS. So go ahead and put in the chat yes or no if you're familiar with the MDE MTSS practice profile. And if you're in a viewing party, just tell your neighbor, have you looked at this? The MDE MTSS practice profile actually defines MTSS as a comprehensive framework comprised of a collection of research-based strategies designed to meet the individual needs and assets of the whole child at all achievement levels. MTSS intentionally interconnects the education, health, and human service systems in support of learners, schools, centers, and community outcomes. So MTSS, by definition in our state, talks about this interconnection of education, of health, of social, emotional, behavioral health, and really being intentional about that. They define 5 essential components of MTSS right within the practice profile. And they talk about the implementation of these essential components as intended to really support educational settings as that framework to organize the strategies and processes we need to eliminate barriers to learning and support successful outcomes. So we have spent the first few minutes of our time together talking about the importance of this integration. So I would like you to take 2 minutes and reflect on the information from this first portion of the session and bullet out some talking points that you would use to explain the importance of integration of academic and social emotional behavior supports for all students. So if you had explained this to someone who didn't know, think about how you would use that. Bullet out a couple points. I'm going to set the timer on my end because that's going to help me make sure we keep going. But what I'd like you to do is if you finish your bullet points before the timer goes off, you can either put them into some of your bullet points in the chat or turn to an elbow partner that's also done and share some of your ideas with them. So go ahead and think about that. What would be in your talking points? Got about 45 more seconds. You can keep writing. If you have yours done, you can add them to the chat. If you're joining us virtually, or turn to an elbow partner and chat for a minute. What were your talking points? All right, friends, if you're still jotting those ideas down, that is A-okay. Feel free to keep going. I'm going to move us into the second part. So we focus first on outcome 1, describing that integration of academic, social, emotional, and behavioral health within an MTSS framework, and how that connects to supporting students with characteristics of dyslexia. You've got some notes on your note catcher. You've got some ideas about elevator speech. So let's go into the second outcome, which is what are some concrete prevention and intervention strategies? Remember, for some of us, these are going to be new strategies, and you're going to want to dig in a little deeper after today's session to really understand how you take what we're talking about and translate it into practice, but we'll give you some ideas and resources to support that. And for others, this is going to confirm the strategies you are using and may help clarify some of the science behind what you're using, or give you ideas on how to further refine and improve your current practices. So we're going to try and meet the needs of the whole groups here. So let's get back to the first behavior science concept just for a minute. Remember, we talked about behavior occurs within a context. So if we use this ABC paradigm that we talked about in the first portion of our time together today, we can think about what we can do to create a safe, predictable, and engaging environment for students. There are specific things that we can do to address the antecedents, what we can do to prevent behavior from occurring. Then there are things under the behavior category that we can do to intentionally teach underdeveloped and pivotal skills students need to set them up for success in school and beyond. And finally, there are a set of consequence strategies that these strategies are going to occur after behavior in response to behavior that are meant to help respond to and reinforce behavior. So we're going to keep that ABC paradigm in mind as we talk about some of these strategies. So just a month ago, in early December, the What Works Clearinghouse published a practice guide titled Teacher-Delivered Behavioral Interventions in Grades K to 5. It was written by a panel of experts in the field of social emotional behavioral health in collaboration with the What Works Clearinghouse. And they identified 7 practical recommendations for teachers to use in their classrooms and other instructional settings to support students in demonstrating pro-social and expected behaviors. It's a great read. If you have not read it, I strongly encourage you to read it. It's included in the electronic materials for today's session, or you can access it by Googling What Works Clearinghouse and then the title of the practice guide. But they've identified these 7 recommendations, and in their guide, they include the recommendation, guidance on how to actually carry out the recommendation, right? So don't just tell us about it, but tell us how to do it. Some potential and common obstacles that may come up as you're trying to do this, each one of the recommendations, and advice on how to overcome those obstacles. And then they've included a number of practical examples of each of these recommendations in practice that can help support their use. So this collection of recommendations is considered to be low-intensity behavioral interventions implemented by educators in the classroom and other instructional settings. And I keep saying "and other instructional settings" because I think it's important to recognize that these are things we can use not only in the classroom, but like in an intervention setting to help support students who are already a little bit behind in their academic skills, their reading skills, and what we can do to support them. 5 of these 7 recommendations actually have strong evidence, and the remaining 2 have moderate level of evidence. The practice guide actually identifies those first 3 recommendations as the foundation for supporting students in demonstrating pro-social behaviors, expected behaviors in classroom, and recommends that these be in place in all classrooms and other instructional settings, like intervention. So we look at those first three as foundation. And then the expert panel encourages us to think about the implementation of one or more of recommendations 4, 5, 6, and 7 based on the needs of the students in that context. So recommendations 1 through 3, all students, all classrooms, preventative approach, all instructional settings, and then recommendations 4 to 7 layered on whichever ones make sense based on your context as needed based on student need. So we're going to take a closer look at recommendations 1 through 3, but I want to put them back into the context of our ABC paradigm. So I've taken those 7 strategies that are primarily and grouped them into those that are primarily prevention strategies, antecedent strategies, those that are intended for teaching, and then those that are consequence or response strategies. And if you notice, recommendations 1 through 3 that I said are those foundational recommendations that we should look to be happening in all classrooms, in all instructional settings, including our intervention settings. You'll notice that there's 1 prevention strategy, 1 teaching strategy, and 1 consequence or response strategy when we look at those first 3. That's no coincidence. It's truly the application of that behavior science in practice. So I also want you to notice that there are 3 recommendations in the category of antecedent or prevention strategies. This is also very intentional. We know research has shown us, we know the best practice is to invest in prevention as much as possible. Dr. Strom talked about that this morning in her session when we were talking about what do we need to do to support students, investing in prevention, early intervention as much as possible, because that's pivotal. So the first 3 recommendations, when implemented well, set students up for, and ourselves as educators, sets us up for success. And then what we want to do is what Dr. Terrence Scott has told us. We're going to set students up for success, and then we want to give them credit for that success, right? They're the ones that are working really hard. We want to make sure they see that we recognize their hard work and effort, and we are acknowledging that. So we're going to take a closer look at those first 3 recommendations, which again are those foundational recommendations meant for all classrooms, all instructional settings. Now we're going to look at that, and the guide itself talked about K-5 settings because that was what the charge was. But there's evidence and research to support the implementation of these strategies beyond the practice guide into middle school and high school settings. So we don't want to lose sight of that. So recommendation 1 is to co-establish, model, and teach clear expectations of student behavior consistent with school-wide expectations. So on your screen, we have an example of what we refer to as a behavior matrix. This is specifically for a classroom. So a classroom teacher took the school-wide expectations at their high school of respectful, organized and achieving, and responsible, mapped those out in this first column, and then for their classroom, identified the procedures that they wanted to define, that the ones that they were using most commonly in their classroom. So they have a procedure for welcome and arrival in class, a procedure for how to handle things during group work, and a procedure for whole class work. So we've got our expectations, and in my classroom, in the classroom with the teacher who developed this, the procedures they wanted to focus in on. And then what they did was they explicitly defined what does it look like to be respectful across all of these procedures? What does it look like to be organized and organized and achieving rather? So here we see that intersection of welcome, arrival, and respectful. In this classroom, to be respectful, they work together to define what it looks like, sounds like. So it's greeting teachers and classmates. It's walk directly to your designated seat. It's talking softly. It's keeping hands and feet and belongings to themselves. So they built this, and each cell of the matrix will clearly identify what the expectations are for that particular procedure. One of the many things I really appreciate about this example is the addition down here in this bottom row of the teacher's role or the conditions for learning. So in this classroom, the teacher's role has been identified as those conditions for learning, and they talk specifically in the cell, what is the teacher doing during welcome and arrival to help set the conditions for learning. So in this example, they're supervising all areas of the classroom, they're greeting students warmly, and they're posting the bell ringer activity. Oops. I just had a bunch of jumping happening. There we go. So very intentionally setting that up for what does it look like for the teacher's role in supporting student learning. The other thing that I think is really powerful about this example is this final column over here on the right, when you feel upset. So in addition to the common procedures in the classroom, they added a column of what do you do when you feel upset. So I just want us all to take a moment and appreciate the implications of this column. First, we're acknowledging that there are going to be times in school when we feel upset, right? We're normalizing that that's going to happen. And even better, we've got this intersection of what do you do when you feel upset and what is my role as the teacher to help support you? Like, how cool is that, right? Being very intentional about acknowledging that and defining what the teacher's role is when a student is feeling upset. The power of acknowledging that is possible that we all might feel upset at school. And here's what the teacher's going to do to support me when I feel upset. But the real magic in having a classroom behavioral matrix isn't that we have it written down and that we've hung it up on a wall. The magic and the power in this comes in actually having all voices, students, teachers, families, co-developing what goes into the matrix. And then the magic continues in the actual modeling and teaching of these expectations, teaching what it looks like, sounds like in these routines. It includes things like teaching the appropriate way to request for a break. It includes things in that when I feel upset column on how to use I statements to express your feelings and how to use a cool off strategy. So we can't just say in the matrix, use your cool off strategy. We actually have to define what the cool off strategy is. We have to teach it. We have to practice it so that in that moment when I'm feeling upset and I'm not my best self and I'm not able to take in new learning and new information, if that's the moment you choose to try and teach me the cool down strategy, nope. You've already taught it to me and you're prompting me to use it. So we also recognize that in that bottom right corner where the teacher's role and the when you feel upset intersect, one of the things that's in there is that we ask the teachers to model cool off strategies. So if we've taught them to the students, we ask the teachers to model them. So picture this. A classroom teacher is saying to their class, gosh, that didn't go the way I had planned for it. And it's bothering me. So I'm going to use our cool off strategy and count to 25 while taking some deep breaths before we move on. If you want to join me in this, go ahead. And then the teacher will proceed to take a few deep breaths while counting to 25 before they move on to the next thing. So before this kind of thing to work, though, we have to actually have defined this, taught this cool down strategy, modeled it, and then we can use it both when we as the adults are feeling upset, but also prompting students to use it when they're feeling upset. So I keep emphasizing the idea of, from the practice guide, how they talk about not only using these strategies in classroom settings, but all instructional settings. So here's another example of a matrix, but this time it's for an intervention group. So taking the same school-wide expectations, but now focusing on what this would look like and sound like during intervention group, right? So the expectations are going to shift a little bit. Recall, we want to have this in all classroom settings and all instructional settings. So intervention group makes a whole lot of sense to build this in proactively and preventatively. The intentional design of this matrix includes specifics to the intervention setting, such as committing to trying even when something is hard or difficult for us. If you recall our commitment activity this morning, it could be something as simple as what we did this morning, right? At the beginning, we recall that sometimes these things are difficult. We're working hard to improve in areas that are hard for us. And here's what we've committed to do when things get difficult, and have a couple strategies ready for students. Another great consideration is building in, what does it mean to accept help when needed, right? So we heard from students in the video how they actively avoided things that were difficult. How do we help students learn to accept that help that's coming through intervention? And how do we help them recognize that, yes, it's difficult, and yes, we have to practice more, but we're going to get there because of the practice, because of the commitments we've made. Again, all of this is going to be co-developed, and then it's going to be taught and modeled and practiced with an intervention group right at the beginning of intervention when it starts, and periodically reviewed and practiced throughout your intervention time. So let's make a connection to Dr. Strom's presentation this morning. Recall her My Brain chant about the brain plasticity. So think about that. In the early grades, this could be introduced within the matrix. taught and used when students say they can't read. And I just want to thank Jamie for the suggestion that Jamie shared that during the chat, that connection of using something like that chant to help respond when students are starting to say, oh, I can't do this, or it's too hard. So we could build something like that right into our matrix and practice it and teach it on a regular basis and use that as one of the strategies I do when things are hard. Here's just one more final example. I know not every school has school-wide behavioral expectations. They have not necessarily adopted that or are in the process of adopting that. So if there are no school-wide expectations, you can still, within an intervention group, spell out what are the expectations for setting students up for success in your group. So the STAR rules really provide students with information about the expectations for intervention. This example actually comes from training done by folks from who are implementing reading mastery and corrective reading as an example. But I encourage you to look right within your intervention materials. There may already be a example of how they've baked in behavioral supports into the intervention. But if it's not there, we still have the opportunity to bake it into not only our intervention instruction, but our Tier 1 classroom instruction. So recommendation number 2 from the practice guide is to remind students to engage in expected behaviors, and it's another one that has strong evidence supporting its use. So providing reminders throughout the day to help students engage in a school-appropriate behavior is going to help build self-awareness and self-regulation. So one way we can do this is through pre-corrections. So pre-corrections sometimes are called prompts or reminders, but it's the idea that it's a reminder that guides us students to engage in an expected behavior during a specific activity. They're provided prior to students engaging in the behavior, hence the name pre-correct. So if you're delivering a correction after a behavior, it's no longer a pre-correct because it came after. Pre-corrects can come in many forms, and they're listed on the screen. It can be a visual, it can be verbal, nonverbal, modeling. I'll give you a really great example real quickly. So I'm known to speak fast, especially when I'm nervous. So on my screen in front of me, I have a visual prompt to slow down, right? So these things are there to help us pre-correct behaviors, especially if we know they tend to happen in certain situations and certain conditions. So again, behavior occurs in a context. If I can recognize those antecedents and provide a pre-correct, a prevention before the behavior happens, I'm minimizing the likelihood that that behavior will occur. The steps of implementing a pre-correct are fairly simple, and they're outlined here on the slide. There are different levels and intensity of the type of pre-corrects you use. The good news is right within that practice guide, they provide you with a pre-correction hierarchy that moves from least to most intensive. The idea is we want to use the least intensive pre-corrects on a regular basis. But for some students, and in some cases, we need more intensive pre-corrects. And so we're going to use those when we need to and then dial it back. So for example, if an initial pre-correct of the visual is not successful, we may increase the intensity of that pre-correct from a visual to a verbal. So instead of me having the slow down example on my computer screen, my friend Lisa, before I start, might remind me, hey, make sure you slow down when you're talking during your presentation. Once I start to follow that on a regular basis, I might not need Lisa to give me the verbal prompt, and we dial it back to the slow down prompt on the screen on the piece of paper. So we just want to be mindful when we're using pre-corrects, watch how they're working. If we need something more intense, we use it. As that becomes successful, we look to scale it back to a more less intense type of pre-correct. And again, the practice guide goes into a lot of details about the use of pre-corrections and gives some examples of what that can look like in the classroom. So the third recommendation is around acknowledging students for demonstrating expected behaviors through positive attention, praise, and rewards. Again, this recommendation has strong evidence behind it. And there are lots of ways we can go about implementing this recommendation in classrooms or other instructional settings like intervention. Here's just one example. It's called the student versus teacher game. It's a quick and easy way to prompt and acknowledge students for demonstrating the group or classroom expectations. The quick overview is that students can earn points, tally marks, for following expectations, for participating in the instruction and intervention. And then the teacher earns the points when students are not following those expectations or not participating. I've included a handout that provides you with much more detail. If you're interested in learning more about this, you can implement it whole group in your classroom. You can implement it small group during intervention. It can be adapted from a elementary setting up through middle school and high school, right? Just think about the context of how we do it. But I want to let you in on a secret on how to set this up for success. The goal of the student versus teacher game is that the students are supposed to win. They're supposed to win on a regular basis because that's going to keep them motivated and engaged to play the game. And playing the game is demonstrating the expected behaviors, in being engaged in the instruction, responding to the questions, to the activities that are part of that instruction. And some people may be thinking, gosh, this sounds really elementary. And it absolutely has worked there, but it also can be contextualized and used at a middle school, high school level. So instead of using a little piece of Post-it paper or a T-chart on my dry erase board, it could be electronically feedback for students, right? So we could set it up that way. It could, the way we play the game and how we set it up could really be intentional about how we can contextualize it and make it more age appropriate for students in middle school and high school settings. So we've talked about recommendation number 1, which was co-establishing and then modeling and teaching expectations in the classroom that align with school-wide expectations. Recommendation number 2, that talks about prompting the expectations on the behavior, and we gave a specific example of pre-crex. And then recommendation 3 was around acknowledging students for demonstrating those expected behaviors. And we do that through this acknowledgement and feedback. And so we talked about student versus teacher game, and that's in more information is available in a handout in your materials for today. In addition to the recommendations from the practice guide, the International Dyslexia Association, or IDA, provides a list of recommendations for supporting students with dyslexia or characteristics of dyslexia in that document I mentioned earlier, titled Social and Emotional Problems Related to Dyslexia. These recommendations could be used hand in hand with the recommendations from the practice guide to support all students, including students with characteristics of dyslexia. So let me just give you a couple examples. When they talk about reinforcing effort, not just a product or outcome, think about recommendation number 3, right? We want to reinforce expectations. Expectations are that we're engaged in the learning, that we're trying and we're open to feedback, that we're accepting help, that we're asking questions, that we're using our strategies when we feel ourselves dysregulated and help us come back. So that reinforcement of the effort there. This concept of when addressing defiant or avoidant behaviors, to not inadvertently discourage students. So helping them put into context, yeah, I get that. This is a difficult task for you to do. And, sometimes you just want to get out of it, but we've got to keep persevering. We've got to try. So we can take a little bit of a break and then we'll come back and try again. So be really intentional about those connections. Another connection to Dr. Strom, her presentation this morning, is to consider how we can leverage her model and description of the reading brain with students and families. Linda in the chat mentioned during her Dr. Strom session, explaining the reading process to students in student-friendly terms and helping students and families understand what dyslexia is and help to remove many of those misconceptions along the way. So being able to talk about what they're feeling, talking about what it means, what dyslexia means and what's happening within our brain on how we learn to read, and eliminating many of those misconceptions that Dr. Strom talked about, and just help understand what this is. All right. So I want to take a little more in our remaining time, a closer look at some additional ways we can truly integrate self-regulation intervention within an academic intervention. So I'm going to give you an example from a case study that was published in 2024. And O'Donnell et al. Really, they looked at how do we do this integration of academic and social emotional behavioral intervention. And so they identified 4 evidence-based elements of behavioral interventions, and then they described an approach of how to embed self-regulation using these 4 behavioral interventions elements into your academic intervention. And so when we talk about self-regulation, it's really that ability to control your emotions, behaviors, and reactions in different situations. And so the first practice that they identified was teaching and reviewing expectations, which should come as no surprise because we just talked about that as recommendation number 1 from the IES practice guide. On the slide, we see from their case example, the expectations for a 2nd grade intervention block. But remember, this concept of teaching expectations can be adjusted based on the context, including the grade level of the students. So your expectations might change, but the concept still stays the same. We're going to teach those expectations. We're going to model them. We're going to reinforce them. The second practice is self-monitoring. In this case example, the self-monitoring of academic engagement. Specifically, that's what they were self-monitoring. And if you recall, right at the end of her talk, Dr. Strom talked about the importance of engagement and how critical that is to learning, motivating, and memory. So this is going to align actually with recommendation number 6 from the practice guide, which we didn't talk about, but specifically hones in on self-monitoring. And self-monitoring interventions can and have been successfully used with students of all ages. We know from research that self-monitoring intervention can be effective for students in increasing things like task engagement, work completion, response accuracy, can help us to reduce problem behaviors across many settings, and it's been shown to be cost effective. It's a pretty powerful intervention. And it can be used with students of lots of different grade levels. So in this example, in their case study of intentionally integrating self-monitoring into an academic intervention, what they did was students were taught that when they heard a signal or a prompt from the interventionist, they should stop and ask themselves whether or not they were engaged at that moment. And then they would simply circle a yes or no, or check yes or no on their monitoring sheet up here and move on with what they were doing. They provided instruction to teach the use of self-monitoring. It included practice with examples and non-examples and discussions of how they rated themselves before they actually started doing it during intervention. The ultimate goal is for students to get as many yeses ratings as possible, but their first step, they focused on making sure we're accurate in our self-appraisal, our self-monitoring. Now I'm going to tell you, for just in real practice, when I was working in a school in the greater Cincinnati area, we taught our kindergarten group. We had a kindergarten classroom. It was an extended day program, 15 students. And the way the day was set up was we would have 5 students working with a classroom teacher, while 5 students were working with a paraprofessional, and 5 students were supposed to be doing independent work. And those 5 students who were supposed to be doing independent work were doing just about everything other than what the teacher had intended them for. So we actually taught them in a very similar way, this self-monitoring. A signal would go off. They were taught when they heard that sound, that chime come in, they had a index card taped to their desk. They were just to mark yes or no, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing at this time. And after a few lessons of practice and then right into a week of doing this with lots of feedback for them for using it and actually stopping and marking and then moving towards accuracy, we had kindergartners who were self-monitoring their behavior during independent work time. So we know it can be done. So they set this up, teaching expectations, layered in the self-monitoring, and then they added a third component, which was self-evaluation. So this came at the end of the intervention session. Students just took a few moments to reflect on how well they met the behavioral expectations for that intervention. And again, this had to be taught to the students. They used student-friendly language. In this case, they looked at the engaged, respectful, and effort. And because they're working with 2nd graders, in their ratings from 0 to 10, they had a frowny face, a straight face, and a smiley face. Age appropriate for 2nd graders, it would look very different if you're working with middle school and high school students, but could be adapted to support them. So think about using a Google form to do the self-reflections. Like there's ways to make those adaptations. So they're teaching expectations, they're self-monitoring their engagement, they're doing a quick self-evaluation at the end of intervention on how well they demonstrated those expectations. And then they ended with what they called a mystery match. And what that was meant to enhance engagement and accuracy in their ratings by using a group contingency with a mystery motivator. So the idea here was that students could earn reinforcers based on the behavior of one or more students in the group. In the way they did this for this group was at the beginning of the intervention session, the teacher would randomly select a student to be monitored, but the students didn't know who the mystery student was. The teacher would observe them throughout the intervention using the same form that the students were filling out. And then at the end of the lesson, they'd do a quick check. Who is our mystery student? And they would put a check mark next to each time the student's self-monitoring and self-evaluation matched up with the teacher. And depending on how many check marks they earned, the group would earn a point towards a goal. So you see this example here is the teacher scoring on the right side, the students is on the left, and then they just did a quick check to see where was their agreement. They put the check marks. In this case, they got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 check marks. If the threshold, let's say, was 5 check marks, the group would earn a point. When the group had earned enough points, they would have access to an agreed upon reinforcement. So again, this is one way that very intentionally the authors looked at 4 specific behavioral intervention strategies that could be embedded into the academic intervention very intentionally. So we can take that same idea and think about the interventions we currently have in place. And are we teaching expectations? Do we want to build in some self-monitoring or self-evaluation? Is that context relevant for what's happening in our intervention group? Do we want to take it a step further and build in something like that group contingency or mystery motivator to help keep our students engaged? So this is our last concrete example of prevention and intervention strategies that can help support us create that safe, predictable, and engaging environment. Last one we're going to cover in today's session. Remember, that was our second objective. And this brings us to our final section and our third objective for this session. It's your chance to develop a mini action plan to support your learning and think about what you're going to do moving into your daily practice. And of course, we're going to spend a little bit of time doing a wrap up. So we have one last video we're going to listen to. Before we get to our action plan, we're going to hear a brief story about this connection between academics and behavior and that value of thinking about this from an integrated model. So this is an excerpt from an episode of the Moth Radio Hour that aired this past summer. There is no visual on the screen. It's only going to be audio. So feel free to stand and listen or stretch and listen to this story. It's called Confidence Game.
Here's Abigail Ladd.
I can't even remember my first con. I was probably still in diapers, but I remember from a really early age thinking adults were really easy to trick, especially if you were cute. And I was wicked cute. I had blonde curly hair, blue eyes, bubbly personality, and all the lisps you could imagine rolled into one. It's actually very hard for me to say that still. But my best con started in kindergarten and ended 3 years later. I peaked very early. But my kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Cobb, was great. She was like a seasoned veteran. She taught all of my siblings before me. There were 3, and they were smart. This is a key detail. Please remember that. You will need it later. So learning to read in her classroom would look like this. She would call me to her desk. She would set a timer. She'd give me a book, and I would stall for as long as possible. I would ask questions. I'd be really adorable. I'd fill her water cup, which was always empty. And this strategy got me safely to first grade. First grade got a little harder. Mrs. Plunkett, who also taught my smart siblings, was a little more attentive. But thankfully, early readers are incredibly repetitive. So I learned that if I sat right next to the teacher's table, and my last name is Ladd, so I'm in the middle of a roster, I could memorize the book before all the other kids were like, while they were reading. So I got kind of like a really good ear for early readers, and I just like smoke through the book. And then she'd give me one unknown book and I had to pee or I had a stomach ache. And I came from a smart family. So I got to second grade. Second grade got exponentially harder for a couple of reasons. One, I had tricked my previous teachers so well, I was in the highest reading group. So the books were longer, less repetitive. I was screwed. And so that one. Second, I had the real life Mrs. Trunchbull as my teacher. Her name was Mrs. Robidoux. She had jet black hair that went down to her calves, a gray streak that went right across the top like a skunk. She had this malicious yell, which she just unleashed on kids all the time. She was terrifying. She also didn't teach any of my siblings, so I had no reputation. And she hated me so much. She was always yelling at me and sitting me in the hallway for like nothing. So I managed to get around reading group because my best friend Ida was in it with me, and she was very smart and could read. So I would have her read it to me as much as possible before it was our turn to go so I could have it memorized. If Ida wasn't there, I'd be like, Frog and Toad don't want to go on an adventure today. And then she'd sit me in the hall and I wouldn't have to read. Problem solved. When we'd read one-on-one, she just told me to pick a picture book off of the shelf. So I would pick one that I already knew really well. It's actually a book I still know to this day, Silly Sally. Silly Sally went to town walking backwards upside down. On the way, she met a dog, a silly dog. They played leapfrog. Get the point. And it worked. She thought I could read it. So the whole year, I was writing down titles, taking them home, get my mom to check them out from the library, read them to me over and over again. I would go back into class, pretend read them to my second grade teacher, pretend mess up, because I knew that if I read them too nicely, she would then, no, I was faking. Surely learning to read would have been a lot easier at this point. But I was like, I was all in, man. I had made it so long. It was such a time commitment. And so by the skin of my teeth, I made it to third grade. And third grade, it all came crashing down. And it wasn't even reading that did it. It was writing, because I couldn't copy paragraphs off the board. It would take me forever because I had to do it letter by letter. And I would get stuck or I'd lose my place. I mean, heaven forbid there was an E. And so Mrs. True, my third grade teacher, was like, she can't read. But I made it 3.5 years in public education without anyone knowing I couldn't read a word. So when I became an elementary school teacher, yeah, I knew what to look for. And I was like, guys, you can't come.
All right, friends. So she ended with, you can't con a con, right? But the idea is that connection, we see that play out in between academics and our social emotional behavioral health and the behaviors we engage in. So one of the recommendations from our practice guide that we didn't address was to offer instructional choices to students to increase engagement and agency. This recommendation has moderate evidence, and we're going to take it and use it now with you all as adult learners. So I want you to start thinking about, what can you do from this session? What are you going to do next with this information? And here are some choices for your consideration for next steps. You can access the IES practice guide. You can take it a step further and actually implement recommendations 1 through 3, or support someone else in their implementation of recommendations 1 through 3, depending on your role. The guide provides good information and resources to help you get started on this path, if that's what you choose. You could read the Michigan Dyslexia Handbook and or the Intensifying Literacy Instruction Essential Practices that Dr. St. Martin shared the link to earlier, and both of those are also available in the folder of materials for this session. Continuing along the theme of choice making, You could choose to sign up for some additional professional learning through the MiMTSS TA Center, get on our listserv, and think about what you might want to access. I have put on the slide just a few of the many high quality professional learning opportunities that exist free of charge through the TA Center that link to today's topic. So there's the Intensifying Literacy Instruction Introduction Series that's starting up next week. There's behavior interventions in the classroom that focus on those low intensity, high frequency behaviors in classrooms and what we can do to support them. There's a whole series on Tier 1 classroom social, emotional, behavioral health supports. One is teaching and reinforcing social, emotional, behavioral skills. There's an alternative reading procedures for classroom use for students in grades 4 through 12. That's coming up in February. There's another Tier 1 classroom SEB support session on regulation for students and staff. And there's an explicit vocabulary instruction focusing on using active engagement that's happening at the end of the month. These and many more professional learning opportunities are out there that might help follow up to what we talked about today. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to put a timer on real quick. I'm going to give you a chance to think about what your specific action steps are going to be coming out of our session today. We know that we increase the likelihood of our follow through on doing something if we actually write it down. And to make it even better for us, we're going to suggest that you go to futureme.org and write yourself an email. You can write yourself an email of what the next steps are going to be, or the big ideas, or something that you're going to follow up on. And then you can select the timeline for when you want it to be delivered to you. It'll come in your inbox. It can be Monday morning you want it there, so you can act upon it. It could be next Friday, right? So give yourself a week. It could be a month or 3 months from now. But the idea is you might lose your piece of paper that you took notes on during today's session, or might not come back to it. It might go into a folder in your filing cabinet. This will pop back into your inbox as a prompt to have you remind you what you thought you were going to do. If you've done it, you can congratulate yourself. Or it might remind you, hey, I was going to commit to reading that, or I was going to commit to working with a teacher to implement recommendations 1 through 3. So go ahead and write yourself a future me email, and your future self will thank you for the follow-up. Just take another minute or two to jot those down. We'll take about 30 more seconds to finish up your mini action plan. All right, friends, you can keep working on your action plan if you haven't finished it, but we're going to move into questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Melissa. That was an excellent session, just full of so much information and helpful resources. We have a lot of comments in the chat talking about how helpful the resources are. So thank you so much for sharing those. We do have some questions. Someone lifted the question, can you please talk about the co-occurrence of ADHD and dyslexia?
So the short answer is kind of, right? Beyond, not completely beyond, but there are other people who know a lot more than I do. But one of the things that I want to caution people to think about is, especially with the video we talked about this, where sometimes what appears to be an attention deficit or disengagement kind of things may be part of avoiding difficulty with reading. And so that's why it's so important when you're looking at something like ADD or ADHD to have a comprehensive evaluation that looks at the child or student in multiple settings and with multiple tasks to see if you see that consistency across all areas, and really pull in people who have deeper expertise to help with that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that answer. Another person asked, at this time, there isn't an official guide for pre-K or grades 6 through 12. And you mentioned that there is evidence to support the K-5 strategies supporting behaviors in secondary. Could you elaborate or speak a little bit more on how secondary educators could adapt to older students?
Absolutely. So one resource just for people to know is if you go to the National PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention Supports Center's website, they have a whole section on implementation of those practices in the secondary settings. And they even have a secondary, like a professional learning community where they get together about every other month and talk about implementation at the secondary level. The underlying principles remain the same, regardless of we're talking about preschool, elementary, middle, or high school. Defining expectations is going to be the same. It's just using age-appropriate language, age-appropriate examples, and having student voice is even more important in that implementation efforts. They will help to shape what those expectations look like. One high school I worked with, they not only define those expectations for students, but they also define them for teachers because they were realizing things like the concept of respect and what respect looks like, what we had as adults in our mind for respect and what the students had in their mind, the high schoolers had in their mind for respect. There was some disconnect there. So being able to come together and having those conversations and coming to a common understanding of what those expectations look like, sound like in different settings, and then the connection there, having student voice in how we acknowledge those expectations is huge across all the way, but especially when you hit middle school and high school. The middle school and high schoolers' brains are still developing. And what we know about that development at that time is they are more interested in peer interactions than they are in adult interactions. So thinking about how do we leverage opportunities for peer interaction as part of those reinforcements. There's also students who aren't going to want public acknowledgement in any way, shape, or form. So doing some preference assessments to see what students are interested in is going to make a big difference to help support how you set those systems up.
That's a really great point. So you're talking a little bit more about like individualization for what's going to motivate particular students.
Absolutely. And you can do that across the school. So the things that you're selecting, students have access to things that they find to be reinforcing. I remember working with a team when they did that. Once they had a group of students who didn't want to have the social aspect. What they really wanted was time to, one student just wanted time to be able to sit in a comfy chair at school and read. And that's what they wanted to work for. And that was what was motivating, not for everybody, but for that student. So making sure you've got those options and choices, not unlimited choices, but choices that are going to help meet the needs of all students.
Great. Okay. Someone else wanted to know, what suggestions do you have when students are no longer motivated by, quote, beating the teacher in some of the games that you had talked about, or when these PBIS type interventions like stickers and candy hold little weight? So they went on to say, for behavior, shouldn't we be taking the valuable information from the ABC framework and determine what motivates the students? That kind of speaks a little bit to what you were just saying, but is there any more elaboration that you can do for?
Yeah, so I appreciate the connection in that question back to the ABC framework. We absolutely should be using that, especially when we start to do more individualized plans for students. We can do things upfront preventatively, whole group. And there are going to be times when something like the student versus teacher game is no longer motivating. So you mix it up and think of different ways that we can provide that feedback. Sometimes it's positive peer reporting, right? So they're giving feedback to each other. Take the adult out of the equation if that's where they're at, and that's what's going to be motivating to them. That cheering along. I've been watching clips of Jennifer Hudson. She has a talk show now, and she actually has her staff line the hallway and cheer on the people who are about to get onto stage to be a part of her interviews, right? So it's just peer interaction and support that can help motivate and bring out the best in us. So thinking about what your students are motivated about, ask them what they want to do, how they want to be encouraged, and then leverage that to design how you go about acknowledging and providing that feedback.
Great. Could you speak a little bit about how these supports fit into a neurodivergent affirming support system for dyslexic students?
Absolutely. So there's so much coming out now and better understanding about neurodiversity and really recognizing the importance of bringing that into the planning. So I always say how important it is to have family and student voice when we're designing plans, and helping to understand that what works well for me is not going to work well for everybody. And what I find to be comforting or reinforcing is not the same for Lisa or for somebody else. And so having that voice a part of this, and recognizing that it looks different. And so I can remember recently having a conversation when we were talking about students in an intervention group, and the interventionist was saying, but the student just can't sit still. They're always up and down and moving. And the principal and the rest of the team, we talked this through, and he said, but how are they doing academically? And she's like, well, they're picking up the skills. And so we're like, well, then we're not as worried about whether or not they're sitting still, as long as they're still learning. We've got to think about that. Each of us is going to approach this slightly different. And within reason, we really want to make sure that we're not trying to make it all look the same, but we have that flexibility within boundaries to help support all students.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. We had a question asking, how can schools look at implementing these behavior supports on a more universal level? So you mentioned the STAR chart. Is there anything else that schools can do to really kind of elevate this to a more universal application?
Yeah, so if the school is not currently familiar with or implementing the practices that fall under school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, or school-wide PBIS, that is a nice place to start. It helps to define school-wide expectations. It helps to kind of shift our mindset from a punitive punishment kind of standpoint to proactive teaching and supporting. We still respond to behavioral errors when they happen, but we do come at it from a more teaching approach and supportive approach. And the MiMTSS TA Center does offer training for school leadership teams to help support that Tier 1 SEBH practices.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. Your session was so informative and wonderful. We just thank you for speaking at our summit today. Before we break for lunch, I want to quickly just make a little housekeeping announcement. The handouts that we have access to and permission to share can be found in the handouts link in the lobby of the online platform. We will also be following up with the morning speakers to ask about sharing slides, and then we will communicate if and when we do have that information. So hopefully we will have it before the end of the day, but the communication may be after today's summit. And with that, we will go ahead and break for lunch.
Before we break for lunch, I just want to make sure people know the closing code is 4436.
Perfect. Thank you so much.